So today we're here in Brighton, and Brighton's known for its beaches and its piers, but it's also the home of the Royal Pavilion Palace. Now this palace has now been opened as a museum to show the transformation from the palace to a hospital for the Indian Sikh soldiers. I'll be joining Kevin, who will be telling us more about how they cared for these soldiers and what the building was used for. The Royal Pavilion is an exotic palace in the centre of Brighton with a colourful history stretching back over 200 years. Built as a seaside pleasure palace for King George IV, it has also served as a civic building, a First World War hospital, and has become a true icon of Brighton. The historic palace mixes the visual style and elegance of India and China. He especially chose Chinese export furniture as well as objects and hand-painted Chinese wallpapers. At that time, the Marine Pavilion was a modest building in size, not suitable for the large social events and entertainment that George loved to host. Then, from 1914 to 1916, the Royal Pavilion was used for Indian soldiers who had been wounded on the battlefields of the Western Front. Medical facilities were urgently required, and it was felt that there were neither the facilities nor the expertise in France to help the casualties. It was then the Royal Pavilion was chosen as the site for a complex of military hospitals dedicated to the care of wounded and Sikh Indian soldiers. Hi Kevin, so can you tell us a little bit about this room and what it symbolises and what happened here exactly?
Hello Amadeep, welcome to the Royal Pavilion. We're standing in the music room, which when the building was the former Royal Palace of King George IV was where his band would play and music recitals were given to the King and his guests. The real significance here for Sikh history is that during the First World War, this room was used as a hospital ward for soldiers from the Indian Army who had been fighting alongside the British on the Western Front.
Oh wow. So why was this room chosen? What's the significance of this room in general?
Well, the significance of this room is really that it's one of the larger rooms in the Royal Pavilion, which meant it was very well suited for accommodating hospital beds, which is why it's very useful for use as a ward for treating patients. The Royal Pavilion itself was chosen as a hospital for Indian troops, largely because it was a large building that was owned by the local authority on the south coast and could be very quickly given over to the military authorities as numerous Indian Army casualties emerged in France and Flanders. But also, I think, in the minds of the British, its sort of very Indian Mughal-influenced exterior of the building, there was a feeling that somehow it would appeal to the Indian men themselves.
I think that the interior, the design in general, it's got an Asian influence to it. I mean, was there any relevance in that, or was it just a random thought just to have this design?
Well, the design itself comes back to King George IV, who took the building, which was originally a fairly modest lodging house, which was first converted into a very sober sort of neoclassical villa. And then in 1850, in fact between 1850 and 1823, it was remodelled by a famous architect called John Nash into the style we see today, which is heavily influenced by Asian design. The exterior borrows from Mughal architecture and is very clearly Indian. The interior we can see is very Chinese, or it's more specifically a style known as chinoiserie, which is not particularly authentically Chinese, but very much a Western European idea of what China might be. And this is the element of the fantasy that very much comes into the pavilion as being a pleasure palace and a place to escape from the rigours of court life in London.
And do the other rooms take a similar theme, or are they all different themes?
No, the chinoiserie theme is evident throughout the pavilion. It's quite a contrast from the outside. But this room is probably the most intense expression of that. If we look at the very vivid reds and the kind of rather fierce dragons and serpents that we can see in the room.
And if we go back to the Sikh soldiers themselves, was it only Sikh soldiers that this room was open to, that the whole pavilion was open to, or was it all soldiers?
The whole pavilion was dedicated to soldiers from the Indian Army. And in fact, it was a complex of 3 hospitals in Brighton which were given over for that purpose. Now, the reason for that is that the hospital here opened on the 1st of December 1914.
Yes.
And this is a time when the Indian Army is making up a sizable part of the British Expeditionary Force who were fighting on the Western Front at that time. I mean, estimates vary, but it seems to be somewhere between about a quarter and a third of those British troops fighting were actually Indian Army troops.
Yes.
And at a time when India itself was under threat with the entry of the Turkish Ottoman Empire into the war and the Germans making lots of claims to be defender of Islam and the fear of uprisings in India, the British want to make extra sure that those Indian men are treated very well, not just in terms of their medical needs, but also their cultural and religious needs. And this was felt that something that couldn't be achieved with a hospital in France, that it needed a dedicated complex where those men could be tended to.
So the original hospital base was in France. What was the reason for bringing that to Britain and in Brighton particularly?
Well, any soldier who was wounded on the Western Front would pass through a series of small dressing or clearing stations for initial treatment.
Yeah.
And the idea was that only those men sufficiently sick or wounded would actually be sent to a hospital for longer recovery times. There was never really an actual permanent hospital base in France for the Indian soldiers. Originally, a number of hospital ships were used, moored off Southampton.
Yeah.
But they clearly weren't adequate for the numbers that were arriving, having been wounded on the Western Front. And the decision really to use Britain for that purpose was largely so the British authorities felt they could actually treat them. Now, Brighton was a very ideal location because it was quite accessible by train from Southampton. Most of the men would have been passed through to Boulogne and then passed over by a ship. So it was a direct train line, and also Brighton was the largest town on the south coast. And in fact, when the military authorities first came here, they originally wanted to use hotels for the purpose of converting them to hospitals, and Brighton had an awful lot of hotels. And it's more by the generosity of the local council at the time that the pavilion was given over as one of 3 buildings in Brighton for that purpose.
So after the reign of King George and up to the start of the war and sort of when the hospital formed, what was this building used as? What was it known for?
Well, the building was used in a variety of ways. After George IV died in 1830, his brother William IV used it and enjoyed it as a palace. And Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837, visited here several times but never felt entirely comfortable with it, and particularly as she had a young family around her, she felt very exposed because the pavilion is right in the centre of Brighton, and she's known in her correspondence to complain about the way local people treated her, being far too close to her. Yeah. And it was also a time when the royal family was trying to sort of rebrand itself away from the sort of decadence of her wicked Hanoverian uncles to be in a much more modest form of royal family, almost like an elevated middle-class family. So Queen Victoria made her last visit here in 1845, and the building was eventually sold to the people of Brighton in 1850. And some of the proceeds of the sale went to fund the construction of Osborne House, her replacement getaway residence on the Isle of Wight. When the building was bought by the town of Brighton, the local people, initially it was just a shell of the building. All the furnishings had been taken away, and for a long time it had no very clear and necessary purpose. Some of the furnishings were gradually borrowed again from the royal family, many of which were still in the original crates in which they'd been shipped out of the pavilion. But it was really used for a variety of purposes, none of which were very clear or necessary. So it was often used for civic events. The mayor would host balls here. You'd even have things like dog shows and hairdressing competitions. The first version of Brighton Museum was set up here in 1861. The Freemasons had a suite of rooms upstairs. The mayor had his office here.
Oh, wow.
But it was never anything very important or necessary. So actually, when the military authorities came in November 1914 and said they had needed accommodation for large numbers of Indian hospitals, it was a very obvious and it was a very easy building for the local authorities to give up for that purpose.
Is it clear who made the decision to help the Indian Sikh soldiers and to turn this building into a hospital?
Well, yes, the man who was commissioned to set up these Indian hospitals was a man named Sir Walter Lawrence, who was a former civil servant of the Raj. He'd previously been a private secretary to Lord Curzon, the very famous viceroy, and also personally knew Lord Kitchener from Kitchener's time as Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army. Yeah. So when the need for these hospitals was recognised, Kitchener personally appointed Sir Walter Lawrence to take up that role, and Lawrence, as a man who's considered to know India very well, and most importantly the political tensions in India, within 2 days came to Brighton to set up this specialised complex of hospitals. Locally, the figure who seems to have been key in offering up the pavilion for that purpose was the mayor of the time, John Otter. And it's quite significant that even after Otter ceased to be mayor, and in fact long after the First World War had ended, Otter was a key figure in driving the memory of these hospitals in Brighton, so he's quite instrumental in the erection of the Chattree, which is a monument over on the Downs, which marks the ghat where Hindus and Sikhs were cremated, those who died in Brighton, and also the Indian Gate, which was opened by the Maharaja of Patiala in 1921 on the southern entrance to the Pavilion estate.
So the Indian Gate is available to see as well. I mean, that's a tourist point as well where we can look at.
Yes, the pavilion, the Indian Gate stands on the southern entrance to the Pavilion estate. A lot of people assume it's an original feature of the pavilion because it's broadly Indian design, but it's actually a much later addition. It was unveiled in 1921 as a gift from the people and princes of India. It's not specifically a war memorial because it doesn't mark those Indian soldiers who died here. It's very much a gesture of thanks for the care given by the people of Brighton to those Indian soldiers.
Does it just look like a normal entrance, or is it separate to the whole building itself?
It's separate to the main building. It's a large brownstone building with a sort of a cupped roof to it. I'm not terribly good at explaining architectural features, but it is very distinct and something that people can see today. For many people, it will actually be their first glimpse of the Pavilion estate when they arrive in the town.
So we're here in the gallery that displays many photos and images of the environment of the hospital at the time. So it also displays many artefacts that were used by the nurses and the hospital staff. So I can see there's a lot of paintings and sort of particular artifacts here. I mean, can you tell me the relevance and what they show, particularly this one? It's such a large painting. Can you talk to me a little bit more about this one?
Well, the items you can see in here are some of the few surviving objects that have come from the time of the Indian hospital here. Very little actually survived in terms of material evidence of the hospital, sadly. We have plenty of photographs. But even though we know there were things like milk churns marked in Hindi and Urdu for the soldiers here, most of them were everyday items that were just reused and haven't survived. This painting that we're looking at is quite a remarkable piece of pictorial evidence of the hospital, because although we have plenty of photographs, obviously they're all black and white, and what this gives is some sense of the colour of the Indian hospital. Partly, of course, the colour of the individual rooms themselves, and this shows the music room in the Royal Pavilion, but also the men themselves. We can see the hospital blues, but also the variety of turbans that the men themselves were wearing. This painting is an oil painting by a local artist called Charles Burley, and he actually painted 3 paintings of the Indian hospital, 2 of which we have in our collection. Another one is at the Imperial War Museum in London, and they're really fascinating, so partly, as I've said, because they are a sort of a colour record of the hospital, but they also give a very different view of the men, because most of the photographs we have here were officially sanctioned by the War Office, so they tend to be quite studied. You know, the men are sitting kind of ramrod straight in their beds, everything looks very disciplined and well ordered. But this particular view is actually quite intimate. You know, you can see the men here playing cards, other men resting. It's a much more familiar view of the scene than we actually see in many of the photographs.
Would he have painted this at the time, or is this his own sort of version of what it would have looked like?
Burghley certainly had access to the hospital. I think through, I believe it's the Brighton Society of Arts, he knew Henry Roberts, who was the director of the library and the museum at that time, and Roberts was quite involved in the production of several guidebooks that were made to the Indian hospital, all of which talk about the pavilion's history, because the British authorities were quite keen to play up the building's royal associations to the Indian patients here. So Burghley certainly would have had access to the hospital itself. It's quite likely that he made sketches and painted them back in his studio. But yes, no, I do believe these are real shots of the hospital as it worked.
Would there have been any sort of barriers in terms of language barriers or understanding, communicating between the doctors and the nurses and the patients themselves, the soldiers?
Well, most of the medical staff who operated here were either retired members of the Indian Medical Service, so these were men who had spent their professional lives in India and would have known something of some Indian languages, particularly Urdu, which was the sort of lingua franca of the Indian army. Other doctors were employed from Indian medical students who were studying in Britain, and of course they themselves would have understood Hindi or Urdu, the two most common languages.
So some of the doctors would have been Indian themselves?
There were a few. We can see that in some of the photographs. We can see Indian doctors here. They tended to be the younger men because they were students, and even though, like many educated Indians, they tended to have nationalist sympathies, they were still quite prepared to work with the British in terms of caring for their fellow Indians at their time of need. Well, the reason the Indian men were so well cared for in the hospitals here was because the British were in a position at the end of 1914 when they absolutely depended on the loyalty of India to Britain during the First World War. Partly that's because Britain is heavily reliant on Indian troops to support its military efforts on the Western Front. It's also because India is in a position of great vulnerability. The Turkish Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of the Germans just a few weeks before the hospital was set up, and this was a case where a Muslim power was dividing the loyalty of many Muslims in India. We know also that the Germans were making heavy inroads and wanting to, gain control, or at least to kind of pretend they would help liberate India from the British. The Suez Canal, Britain's main point of access to India, was under threat from the Turks. And Britain really needs Indian loyalty. So the hospitals here, I think, are partly to show the benevolence of the British Empire. It's to show that this is an empire that does not simply exploit the men who are fighting for the king, but that they really understand their religious and cultural needs. And essentially, I mean, what happens here is to some extent a propaganda exercise, but it's also true that the letters from many of the men shows that they actually were genuinely well cared for.
But don't you think they went sort of above and beyond what they needed to do? Because I mean, I was reading about a letter from Ishar Singh, and he wrote that he had just regained consciousness, and that he sent a letter back just saying he was in a life of luxury. I mean, they adhered to every need that he had. And we were looking at some artifacts over there, and they showed a dietary schedule as well of what they could and couldn't eat. I mean, don't you find that that's quite above what they were sort of expected to do?
I think you're quite right. In fact, when I conducted some of the research for this gallery about 6 years ago and looking through some of the personal correspondence from Sir Walter Lawrence, the man who set up the hospitals, there's one particular letter he writes to the Viceroy in India where he talks about the measures taken here to be almost an over-elaboration. So there's almost a recognition by the British themselves that they were really pushing the boat out and then some to care for those men. And I think partly that is because the British desperately need to make this political point and send this message back to India about how well the men are being cared for. But it's also, I think, because they're effectively engaging in a huge social experiment which had never happened before. There's suddenly a small corner in the centre of a large town on the south coast which is being converted into something that ran almost like an Indian village in terms of there being a system of followers to sort of tend to the kind of cooking and the laundry needs, and even having open air cremations for Sikhs and Hindus who died here, which was and is technically illegal, to a specially laid out cemetery for the Muslims who died here. And I think if you're going to create this experiment somewhere in England, you have to do everything you can to make it work, and I think that's much of what drives this.
So you know how most Sikhs at that time would have been vegetarian, and they would have sort of wanted to eat certain things, especially when they were recovering. I mean, was that all looked after? Was that all cared for as well?
Yes, enormous care was given to the dietary needs of the men as well. There were 9 separate kitchens set up in the ground so that food could be cooked, particularly for Hindus, by their fellow caste members, but also by their co-religionists. There was also a whole micro-industry grew up nearby in Brighton, so there was a pavilion dairy set up where milk could be transported in churns marked in Urdu or Hindi for whether they were for Muslims, Sikhs or Hindus. There was even an enterprising butcher nearby called Mr. Tate who dedicated his backyard to slaughterhouses for both halal and jhatka slaughter for sort of Hindus and Muslims. And again, this is something that's probably almost never been seen in England before this point.
So I think that's one of the most interesting points, that the local public as well as the British government was so keen to make sure all the Indian soldiers were comfortable. I mean, why do you think that this building, the whole hospital itself, isn't that known in terms of Sikh history? I mean, I think it's more related to King George itself. I mean, why do you think the message hasn't gone out there?
I think the message is getting out there gradually. I mean, it's certainly something we've been gradually promoting over the last 6 years since we opened the gallery here. And particularly the centenary of the First World War has obviously given cause for people to stop and take stock of the conflict and what it really meant. I think for us as a historic house, one of the big challenges was that if you're presenting a house in a historical context, you tend to present it in one particular time period. Yeah. And as a royal palace, it's largely restored to look as we believe it would have looked in 1823 when the building was finished in this form. And it's very difficult if you take that approach to try to tell another very different story that takes place 90 years later. Yes, yeah. So it wasn't until we developed the gallery here in 2010 that we really started seriously talking about this story. But I think it's also that in most narratives about the First World War, the sort of presence of non-white soldiers has never been particularly prominent, and it is something that many academics and other community groups are now looking at in more depth. I mean, certainly the UK Punjabi Heritage Association have done some fantastic work in bringing the Indian and particularly the Sikh contribution to light. And I think also there is an element in terms of Indian history as well, in which it never fit very well with the nationalist narrative. It seems very much like a sort of a war of exploitation by the British, which you could argue that it is, but I think at the same time it is a human story. You know, those Indian soldiers were there. Absolutely, regardless of those political pressures. It is an extraordinary journey that these rural men who would never have expected to go to Europe, let alone fight in a huge industrialised war, the like of which no one had ever seen before. And suddenly after all that to find themselves in something that they're told is the King's Palace and this extraordinary opulent building. I mean, that's an incredible story regardless, I think, of the political interpretations. And
do you think in terms of future developments you'll be uncovering more about the Sikh history, maybe displaying more, dedicating more of the rooms to show about the hospitals and to show how we helped the Indian soldiers?
Certainly over the years we've looked at new ways of telling the story. The most recent means of doing that was a new audio tour that people can take part in, which is really talking in depth about the history of the hospital here, and it can actually allow us to do that in the rooms themselves. But there are so many histories of the pavilion that we need to talk about. So after the Indian hospital closed here, there was another hospital set up for treating limbless British men, which again is a very interesting story because this is a hospital that's set up not just to care for the immediate medical needs of the men, but also to take those who've lost arms and legs and actually equip them for new life in the future. It's actually where you can see the origins of the British welfare state actually in stories like that. So there's so many stories for us to tell, and I think a lot of what we do now is to try and tell this story online, in particular so those people who can't visit the pavilion because they live too far away, perhaps in India or Pakistan, can actually learn something about this story or download and reuse the images.